very much, Peter. I'm thrilled to be part of this conference. Thank you very much, and thank you very much, Professor Eliot Borenstein from New York University for joining us for this conference. I think most of you already know Professor Borenstein, or at least his books, his works. He works on Russian modernism, postmodernism. He's someone who really works on popular culture and its impact on literature and vice versa. Many of us work on popular culture, but Eliot Borenstein is really into it. Graphic novels. You would probably be also competent in video games, computer games, and so on. I don't know.
Not according to my son.
Not according to your son, but so he has published widely on sexuality and literature and so on. His first book was Overkill: Sex, Violence, and Russian Popular Culture after 1991. We use it in free work for a seminar. Actually, whenever you have the impression that you found a really hot and interesting topic, there's a good chance that Eliot Borenstein already published a book on it 5 years before. One other book, Men Without Women, Masculinity and Revolution in Russian Fiction, published in 2000. Professor Borenstein is also very prolific in publishing on various blogs. He's the editor of the All the Russians blog of the New York University Jordan Center of Advanced Study of Russia. And there you can find terribly well written short pieces on what is actually happening in the US, in Russia and the surrounding countries. Yesterday, preparing this short introduction, I read your piece on the resurrection of Arkady Babchenko, where you managed to draw links between Arkady Babchenko's resurrection and Jon Snow's. You even mentioned Ned Stark and so on. So this is his way of approaching these topics, always intelligent, always really well written. Why did we invite Professor Borenstein to give a keynote lecture at this conference?
Yes, please do tell me.
He launched a blog project called Plots Against Russia: Conspiracy Theories in Contemporary Russia. The blog is actually finished. There were postings on a regular basis touching upon, what was going on in Russia. And this blog is now transformed, or has already been transformed, into a book that is due to be published now. The text is already at the publishers, and the book will be entitled Plots Against Russia: Conspiracy and Fantasy After Socialism, to be published with Cornell University Press. So he's the best keynote speaker we could have probably imagined for our conference. Thank you very much to join us for this conference. You have the floor.
Thank you. I'll go up here then. So thank you for that introduction, Jens, and Peter and Alois for organizing all this and inviting me. I'm very humbled to be aware that I have the English advantage through no effort of my own, and I was hearing stories about the multilingual teaching so many of you do on a regular basis. So anyway, I'm aware that in general in the United States I speak too fast. It's a New York thing, and I also tell my students, please let me know when I'm speaking too fast. And usually there's too strangely polite, which is something I don't understand in New York. But so I'm going to try not to speak too fast, and I'm going to fail. So please do let me know when I am going too fast. Anyway, so yes, so my talk today, actually I went through 3 different versions of what I was going to do today because of the fact that I've written this whole book on the subject, and I ended up with the one I'm doing now, so you're stuck with it. So I think I will just get started. So after spending enough time on the Russian internet, flipping channels on state television, leafing through extremist newspapers, or simply reading the latest action-packed potboilers, it's easy to come to the conclusion that Russia is under siege, from within as well as from without. The country's apparent enemies include jihadists, communists, oligarchs, the CIA, the FSB, Georgians, Ukrainians, a rainbow coalition of color revolutionaries, homosexuals, Harvard University, and let's not forget the Jews, because trust me, no one else has. The building blocks of conspiracy may change or more likely simply increase in number, but their possible combinations and permutations are limited only on the level of small detail. If it seems that I'm picking on Russia, I hasten to point out to anyone with a Facebook friend who watches the American television channel Fox News, and that anyone can testify that my own home country, the United States, is hardly immune to syncretic conspiratorial thinking. After all, that country on 2 occasions elected a gay Kenyan Muslim black separatist socialist secular antichrist, proving yet again that for a black man to succeed in America, he has to overachieve. The fact that he was replaced in office by a man who praises Alex Jones' InfoWars in the National Enquirer while hyping the non-existent threats of voter fraud and murderous illegal immigrants speaks for itself. I try not to use his name like with Voldemort in Harry Potter. I'd like to think of him as he who must not be named, but he names himself so often and everything after him that there's almost no point. And also for me, doing this book was very strange, I have to say. I started out working on conspiracy about 20 years ago, and I was a little embarrassed by it because I thought I was exaggerating a fringe phenomenon. Then, after enough time, I wasn't, and now it's come home to me. So it's very, very odd. So Russia is not alone when it comes to conspiracy. Indeed, we should see the growth of conspiracy theory in both Russia and the United States, I can't speak to Europe, as yet another manifestation of a decades-old rivalry. Which country can outperform the other in conspiracy theory production? The rise of conspiratorial thought in the United States is well studied and sadly a very relevant phenomenon, and I talk about it a bit in my forthcoming book. Russia's multiple brands of conspiracy are far less familiar on a global level, though they're getting there. But the country has not been idle. For at least 50 years, Russia, along with the Russophone diaspora, has been a reliable provider of conspiratorial narratives, overfulfilling virtually any conceivable paranoid plan with Stakhanovite zeal. And I use the hackneyed Stakhanovite metaphor advisedly, since it has been decades since Russia could be accused of the hyperproduction of anything besides oil, or at least of anything tangible. Here I recall Mikhail Epstein's marvelous essay, Labor of Lust, in which he demonstrates that any failure to produce factories, heavy machinery, and weapons on the scale demanded by the various 5-year plans was easily remedied by a proliferation of images and text, that is, discourse about factories, heavy machineries, and weapons. In the symbolic realm, Russia and its precursor, the Soviet Union, was a powerhouse of productivity, an inexhaustible manufacturer of simulacra and simulation. Conspiracy, however, is not mere simulation. It takes all the various mythemes available to it and turns them into a persuasive narrative. That is, conspiracy is a kind of discursive bricolage. Even this formulation is not entirely satisfactory, since it looks at conspiracy on too large a scale, and I have a whole chapter about looking on conspiracy on a small scale. The basis of all the mythemes and tropes that form a conspiracy theory is a much more fundamental substance: information. Conspiracy is a disease of information, and a communicable disease at that. A better word, though, would be disorder, if it weren't for the fact that conspiracy's relation to information is to take what is disordered and express it as a surplus of order. It is a disorder of signal to noise, in which all noise is construed as signal. Nothing is accidental. Conspiracy does what centuries of lunatics' failed attempts at perpetual motion machines could not. Conspiracy fights entropy without increasing entropy. Operating according to an inversion of the second law of thermodynamics, conspiracy concentrates all information into an increasingly orderly system. Trying to define conspiracy theories is a thankless and ironic task. Thankless in that there is a vast body of literature on the subject that must be addressed. Ironic in that the term conspiracy theory is so familiar as to be part of common knowledge, when the philosophy of the conspiracy theory is based on the idea of hidden knowledge. We know a conspiracy theory when we see it, but what we know is that it is an argument that there is something we don't know because we can't see it. It is the unknown that we know everything about. Conspiracy takes on its form and character in direct relation to a given society's information ecosystem. That is, to the media and cultural habitat that can facilitate and or restrict the circulation of information. In Russia, over the last 50 years or so, we find 3 particular information ecosystems that give rise to 3 different phases of conspiracy theories. The first is late socialism. The second is roughly coextensive with Perestroika and the Yeltsin years. And the third is today's era of Putinist conservatism and the rise of social media. Unlike so many patterns that Slavists are used to seeking and finding in modern Russia, these phases are not characterized by rupture. Indeed, the very syncretism that is so fundamental to conspiratorial thought admits no rupture, to the extent that it admits no contradictions. Though conspiracy theory's approach to information is anti-entropic, its development is usually expansionist and hegemonic. Everything fits, and every seeming contradiction can be turned into another confirmation. In the American context, Michael Barkun shows us the confluence of initially separate conspiracy theories into one master conspiratorial narrative whose complexity would put Foucault's pendulum to shame. Any good conspirologist knows that the Elders of Zion and the Freemasons are actually working with the lizard people who dwell within our hollow earth and the gray-skinned aliens who are somehow never satisfied no matter how many anal probes they perform on unwilling abductees. Apparently, anal probes are like potato chips. You can't stop at just one. Late socialism functioned as a petri dish for conspiracy theories, providing the ideal conditions for their development. First, we must acknowledge that there was no need to invent conspiracy whole cloth. It is Tsarist Russia, after all, that bequeathed the protocols of the Elders of Zion to the world at large, though in one of Russian culture's perpetual ironies, even this native product turned out to have been initially stolen from France, like neoclassicism or Salat Olivier, and Russified to near unrecognizability. Added to the semi-native heritage is the lesson that the protocol's pedigree teaches us. Conspiracy theories cross national boundaries with the greatest of ease, which means that the entire European heritage of conspiracy theory was at late socialism's disposal. Yet it was more than just this heritage that made late socialism such a good home for conspiracy theory. The Brezhnev era was marked by any number of shortages of this or that consumer good. But what was truly in short supply was information. The state, media, and government famously restricted access to news and cultural production. Though the USSR's official ideology was, of course, communism, its approach to information was more mercantilist. Information was a scarce resource to be conserved, if not hoarded, and the state jealously guarded its stash of information like a dragon sitting on a treasure trove of gold in a castle or a cave. But the absence of gold encourages the development of alternative currencies. The scarcity of reliable information and the nakedly partisan way in which it was presented not only facilitated skepticism about official pronouncement, but also left a knowledge vacuum easily filled by speculation and rumor. Far from hard currency, but speculation and rumor was what people had. If we follow through on my currency metaphor one last time, facts were Deutschmarks, while conspiracy is Bitcoin. Again, the effects of information deprivation went far beyond their national boundaries. In the West, Kremlinology thrived on a paranoid conspiratorial epistemology that combed over every word published in Pravda and every movement in state funerals for something on which to construct an often shaky hypothesis. It is this skepticism that shows the weakness of the Cold War propaganda model of mass culture. In response to the clear limits of official information, Soviet subjects of late socialism did not simply accept everything they heard uncritically, just as most of them did not become anti-Soviet dissidents. Rather, the assumption that people are being lied to produced an entire genre of what might be considered urban folklore, or at least urban folk knowledge. Alternative theories about what's really going on and who is really in charge. Engaging in this sort of speculation did not necessarily entail adopting an anti-Soviet subject position. Quite to the contrary, casual everyday conspiracism could even be viewed as defining the late Soviet subject position. The assumption that all leaders and bureaucrats are self-interested liars is certainly cynical, but by no means revolutionary, in that its challenge is not to the utopian ideology of the regime, a better future through communism, but to the utopian anthropology that justifies it. Late socialist casual conspiracy turns its skeptical eye on human nature far more than it does on a given political system. The situation involves the dynamics of glasnost and chirnucha, that is pessimism, naturalism, and muckraking. While the policies of glasnost purported to fill in the blank pages of history, these pages had never been truly blank. The facts had been known or suspected, or speculation had filled in the gaps. Glasnost functioned on the boundaries of revelation and confirmation, since what was brought to light was never entirely unknown. Rather, it is the fundamentally melodramatic ritual of exposure, разоблачение, that endowed the disclosure with meaning and power. It is not that the truth could set you free. The truth itself was set free, released from the confines of conspiratorial epistemology. Yet glasnost, rather than sounding the end of conspiracy, gave it a new lease on life. The exposure of the hidden truth may have meant the end of specific secrets, but it ultimately confirmed the prevalence of secrecy and the validity of conspiratorial epistemology. What could be a more valid response to all this than to ask, who knows what else they're keeping from us? Which is the antecedent to the biggest conspiratorial meme of Putinism. Кто за этим стоит? Who's behind it? This is particularly understandable given the pendulum swings of Soviet-era reforms, dating back to Khrushchev. Partial truths were given out during the thaw, piece by piece, only to be elaborated under Gorbachev, but the slow, multi-step process of revelation was not conducive to the belief that the whole truth had been disclosed. There's always some piece of truth that's waiting to be exposed. So late socialism encouraged a kind of casual conspiracism, and glasnost confirmation of decades of government lies and omissions only intensified the distrust that lay behind conspiratorial thought. But there were already more committed versions of conspiracism, ready for more widespread adoption with the changes in the media in the perestroika and post-perestroika eras. More committed conspiracism directly challenged the regime of power knowledge that constituted late Soviet ideology. Here we have right-wing dissident counter-narratives, complete with their own myths of origin. For the sake of brevity, which is a virtue that I seem to have suddenly recalled, will probably forget almost immediately, let me just mention two of the most important conspiratorial narratives floating around at that particular time. Each of them is a variation on the theory that the United States has been conducting covert operations to destroy the Soviet Union or Russia by subverting public morals and destroying Russian culture. As so happens with conspiracy theory, there's an undeniable grain of truth here. After all, was not the very existence of radio liberty an open attack on official discourse, which renders RT, the former Russia today, a long-delayed ответный удар. The most elaborate version of this narrative was developed in immigration, but made its way back to Russian and samizdat, the writings of Grigory Klimov. In both his nonfiction and his novels, which were intended to be read as fictional glosses on hidden truth, Klimov warned his readers about the sinister Harvard Project, Garvardsky Projekt. The Harvard Project gives the anti-Semitism of the protocols of the Elders of Zion a pseudoscientific cover, updating them with the preoccupations of the Cold War, mind control, the American threat, and contemporary sexual panic, predatory homosexuals and military lesbians, and reinforcing the religious dimension by approaching biblical texts and religious differences in terms of genetics and evolution. The beauty of Klimov's formulation is that it is both Soviet and anti-Soviet. The Cold War enemy is truly a threat, but both America and the Soviet Union have been controlled by Jews from the very beginning. Surprise. Klimov developed an all-purpose demonology that gives the appearance of rigor while actually being extremely flexible. The result has all the hallmarks of the most baroque conspiracy theories to attract attention in the West, such as that Lyndon LaRouche's assertion that the Queen of England is an international drug kingpin working with the Rothschilds, because clearly what the House of Windsor needs is more income. Klimov finds his enemies slightly closer to home. For decades, Russia has been under siege by a cabal of genetically defective Jews and homosexuals, which are virtually synonymous in Klimov's terms, plotting the country's downfall from behind the ivy-covered walls of Harvard University. I think they got that part right. Somewhat surprisingly, a close cousin to Klimov's theory actually found its way into an officially published work of Soviet fiction, the anti-Soviet brainwashing campaign that would eventually take the name the Dulles Plan, Plan Dullesa. Reminiscent of both Klimov's novel Имя мое легион and Verkhovensky's speech in Dostoevsky's Besy, the broad contours of the plan first appeared in Yuri Dulbikhailev's 1965 novel I один в поле воин, but reached a much broader audience when attributed to an SS officer in Anatoly Ivan's Вечный зов, the Eternal Call. And I quote, Окончится война, все как-то утрясется, устроится, и мы бросим все, что имеем, чем располагаем. Все золото, всю материальную мощь на оболванивание и одурачивание людей. Человеческий мозг, сознание людей способно к изменению. Посеяв там хаос, мы незаметно подменим их ценности на фальшивые и заставим их в эти фальшивые ценности поверить. Как, спрашиваешь, как? Мы найдем своих единомышленников, своих союзников и помощников в самой России. Should I give the English? Sure. When the war ends, everything will work itself out, and we will throw everything we've got, everything we own, all the gold, all the material strength, on turning people into idiots. The human brain, people's consciousness are all capable of change. After we see chaos in them, we will imperceptibly switch out their values for false ones and make them believe in these false values. How, you ask? How? We will find like-minded people, our allies and our helpers in Russia itself. Though this particular line of thought would only be christened the Dulles Plan in 1993, it already provided a broad framework for understanding the Cold War in terms of conspiratorial melodrama, while still casting the relations between opposing sides in terms of symbolic exchange. One of the most striking things about the text of the Dulles Plan is its obsession with popular culture. The Dulles Plan is as much media theory as conspiracy theory, a perhaps unintentional example of an outdated model that assumes propaganda works as intended, and that audiences are helpless to resist. The media effects school, or the hypodermic model, most recently resurrected in Peter Pomerantsev's Nothing is True and Everything is Possible. Consistent with Soviet policies that carefully restricted access to media, culture, and information, the Dulles Plan can only make sense if culture is understood in narrow, quasi-biological terms. The Dulles Plan is based on an implicit definition of media and consumer, emphasizing media's nutritional content. While some forms of cultural production are quite simply good for you, the classics for instance, there are others that are not merely innately harmful, but whose entire purpose is moral or ideological harm. The audience, meanwhile, is totally passive and unable to interpret or reinterpret the signals coming to them. The media consumer is essentially an open orifice, receiving all input indiscriminately. Compare this with the conspiratorial mania that characterized the Stalin years. Certainly censorship was strict and propaganda was unrelenting, but the crimes of which alleged conspirators were accused were not restricted merely to anti-Soviet agitation. Wreckers were sabotaging industrial projects, and spies and internal enemies were engaged in assassinations and attempted murder. The Dulles Plan turns out to be perfect for both the Cold War and its aftermath. Violence and subversion are now entirely discursive. Equally important is the Dulles Plan's focus on youth. By positing nearly all forms of popular youth culture as dangerous, something the plan shares with moral panics throughout the modern world, the Dulles Plan weaponizes the generation gap. Young people are not merely strange and perhaps impertinent, the perennial complaint about kids today. They are the victims and perpetuators of warfare against everything the country stands for. It is the combined focus on media and youth that ensures the Dulles Plan's longevity. The structure of cross-generational misunderstanding can endure even as the content of youth culture changes. As Americans with long enough memories will recall, the evolution of popular music is also the story of successive media panics from jazz to rock to hip-hop. The generation vilified by the Dulles Plan in its early days is now the generation that could find itself appalled by its own children's culture. If we borrow the language of Putin's third term, and sadly fourth, the Dulles Plan is all about values. Thanks to the plan, conspiracy is a culture war, or to borrow, once again from today's terminology, information war. The Dulles Plan's formulation in 1993 points to the second phase of the informational ecosystem I mentioned, perestroika in the 1990s. This ecosystem gives us the opposite extreme from that of late socialism. We move from information deprivation to information overload. Here we're dealing with a more recognizable postmodern condition, recognizable because it is the version of the condition that has long obtained in the West. This new embarrassment of informational riches could have served to debunk, to disprove conspiratorial thinking entirely. But in fact, the opposite occurred. Revelation after revelation about the hidden crimes and corruption of the Soviet Union served as confirmation of the conspiratorial mindset. This is when conspiratorial thinking moves from the underground to the mainstream. I don't want to dwell on this period as much because I've talked about it at great length before, and because it's also the version of conspiracy with which many of us are most familiar. In Overkill, I argue that in the 1990s, everyone learned the language of crime. Today I would add that they also learned the language of conspiracy, which, like that of crime, was a subcultural language that was now given unprecedented popular exposure. As in the West, conspiracy provides the basic framework for thrillers and action stories. The heroes are inevitably fighting those who plot against Russia, often using a conspiratorial framework that seems to be stripped of its conventional ideological content. The heroes fight organizations that look like right-wing visions of Jews and Masons, but are not called Jews and Masons. In the 1990s, as conspiratorial narratives were now free to combine and recombine like viruses swapping genes, they tended to revolve around one of the dominant paradigms of the post-Soviet era, catastrophe. With catastrophe, conspiracy managed to be both a myth of origin and a prophecy of the future. Here is how our secret enemies brought us to our knees, and here's how they're planning to utterly destroy us in the coming days. Just as Engels brackets all of human history between a primitive communitarian lost Eden and an eventual communist golden age, so too does Yeltsin-era conspiracy enclose modern Russian history with identical catastrophic origins and endings. We see this with the evolution and eventual replacement of the Harvard Project. The Harvard Project reaches its apotheosis in a trilogy of novels by S. Norka that combine Klimov's ideas with the structure of the thriller, the establishment of an actual inquisition in Russia, because no one expects the Russian Inquisition, and the country's salvation by a dark horse, Temnaya Lashchadka, who looks very much like Vladimir Putin. From this point on, though, the Harvard Project, once its own independent force for xenophobic paranoia, is superseded by the Houston Project. Or to be more precise, it is subsumed, it is annexed, like a disputed discursive peninsula, by a larger neighboring narrative with quasi-imperial ambitions. This produces a peculiar imaginary geography where Harvard and Houston, two names rarely uttered in the same breath in America, coexist on opposite sides of a shared border. For the early Putin era, though, this game of imaginary topography is actually prophetic. Ideas, that is Harvard, are trumped by oil, Houston. Not to mention the fact that Putin's first term in office coincides with the presidency of a former Texas governor. An imaginary evil Texas is the perfect straw man to petrify a petrostate. The Houston Project, while as much a flight of fancy as the Protocols or the Dulles Plan, appears to share one of the few saving graces of the Harvard Project. It is not the result of plagiarism. In fact, it seems to be entirely unsourced. Appropriately enough for a digital phenomenon, it may not even have a clearly defined original. Searching for the Houston Project reminds us of the beauty and complexity of conspiracy as a viral internet phenomenon. No one really owns it. As a result, its manifestations and elaborations vary wildly. I highly recommend the YouTube videos by Svitlina Works, which are a source of unending, if unintended, hilarity and entertainment. Look them up. They involve kung fu videos and the song, talking about the end of Russia while kung fu videos are playing, and the song, Feelings, playing in the background. I, to this day, do not understand it, but admire it. Compared to the Houston Project, both Harvard and Dulles look like underachievers. It is with the Houston Project, as elaborated by General Petrov and his many imitators, that conspiracists really start thinking big. Harvard and Dulles conceive of the apocalypse as a local event. The end of Russia might well be the end of the world if you live in Russia, but otherwise, who knows? The Houston Project loops around to global annihilation while never losing sight of the centrality of Russia. The Houston Plan goes back to the conspiratorial well. No, not anti-Semitism. That particular poison well was already tapped out by the Harvard Project. It goes back to the cabal of multinational schemers who really run the world. The renewed emphasis on the cabal is the result of a Western import. By the beginning of the 21st century, many of the most popular English-language conspiratorial tracts are translated and published into Russian, thanks to a very strong link with Lyndon LaRouche. John Coleman's Conspirators' Hierarchy, the Committee of 300, is repeatedly referenced as a perfect feedback loop, reinforcing both the greed of Americans and particularly the Clinton administration responsible for the bombings of Serbia that drastically changed the outlook on Russian-American relations from then until now, while also emphasizing the greatness of Russia itself. And its way was paved by the Houston Project. For the Houston Project, the expropriation of Russian resources is only the beginning. The real goal of Western conspirators is far more evil and also a much more primal threat to blood and soil notions of Russian identity. The Houston Project makes literal one of the primary metaphors of national betrayal, that Russia is being bought and sold. Now the truth comes out. The West is plotting to take the Russian land itself. Why, you might ask? It seems the West wants to move to Russia. It turns out that Moscow is not just the fourth Rome. Soon, all of Russia will become the next Mount Ararat, even though the first one is practically a neighbor. When the rest of the world succumbs to ecological catastrophe, only Russia, particularly Siberia, but only Russia will remain habitable. This scenario is the result of yet another mutation in Russian conspiracy theory. Just as the Houston Project is packaged as the next, more detailed iteration of the Harvard Project, its detail is drawn from yet another set of sources. Much of the content of the Houston Project is filled by the growing lore accruing to a powerful local Russian conspiracy called the Golden Billion, Zolotoy Miliard. First put forth by A. Kuzmich, the pen name of Anatoly Kuzmich Tikhonov, in a book called Заговор мирового правительства России Золотой миллиард. The Golden Billion was quickly popularized by the prolific Sergei Karamurza and has become a staple of Russian contemporary conspiratorial thought. The Golden Billion represents a real change in the Dulles-Harvard rhetoric of conspiracy, in that it is based less on bad social science than it is based on bad natural science. In a refreshing change from what is familiar to followers of American conspiracy and right-wing discourse, the Golden Billion takes the prospect of ecological change seriously. So seriously, in fact, that most of the plans of the world government are predicated on the impending global disaster. The coming cataclysm is not just a matter of climate change or even the depletion of fossil fuels. The Golden Billion is a nightmare vision of overpopulation. The Golden Billion weaponizes Malthusianism. The billion in Golden Billion refers to an imagined ideal population for a sustainable planet. The golden part describes the class dynamics on which the conspiracy is built. The developed world is maneuvering to a point where 1 billion people, the wealthier people from the wealthiest parts of the globe, populate the planet. It is not the meek, but the rich who shall inherit the earth, which makes some sense since they have the most experience with inheritance. The Golden Billion also has the attraction of an uncompromising Russocentrism. If the only inhabitable territory left on the globe were in, say, Africa or Australia, the theory would be far less compelling. Russia would be destroyed, but only as part of a larger story of calamity. The Golden Billion tells the opposite story. It is the God-given right of Russia to survive the apocalypse. But the West is conspiring to steal Russia's very destiny along with its land. Here the power and desirability of the Russian land are reinforced precisely by the covetousness of the enemy, and the struggle against this plot can be yet another heroic tale of defense of Russia from invasion. The Golden Billion gathers together most of the important tropes of benighted post-Soviet Russia: the need to defend the country's national resources from the West demoralization of Russia's youth, the destruction of Russia's economy, and the destruction of public health, into one compelling narrative, a story combining historical touchstones, the Great Patriotic War, with science and pseudoscience. It also builds on and sustains the hostility towards population control encountered throughout the Russian media in the Putin era, in which the distribution of condoms is a clever Western plot to bring down Russian birth rates, as is the support, of course, of gay rights. This idea is often reinforced by an unsourced but frequently repeated quote from Margaret Thatcher. And I feel bad defending Margaret Thatcher from slander, because why would I defend her? But still, she supposedly said that Russians should be reduced to a population of 15 million. All of this can be summed up in a phrase that is common to Russian extremist discourse and made more mainstream by the conflict in Ukraine: the genocide of the Russian people. In a Russocentric world, there could be no ending more catastrophic than that. Catastrophic endings provides me a fine segue to the supremacy of Vladimir Putin. If under Yeltsin conspiracy became a common language, under Putin, particularly since his return to office after Medvedev, conspiracy is a meta-language. One of the many brilliant moves of Putin and his supporters is to co-opt the language of conspiracy and falsification so thoroughly that all symbolic exchange of truth value collapses into false equivalencies. As the 2012 protest movement captured video after video of suspicious election activity, police brutality and corruption, i.e. uncovering a state conspiracy to claim power through unlawful means, state television responded with charges that the falsification itself had been falsified. Here I should note the contrast between the way conspiratorial accusations used to be handled in the United States until last year, and the way they're handled in Putin's Russia. In the States, the guiding principle before Trump was not to engage with conspiratorial accusations, because engaging simply feeds the beast. Hence the long months before Obama's final anticlimactic release of his long-firm birth certificate. The Kremlin's response is to engage at all costs, because feeding the beast is in the regime's best interest. Two television documentaries in the wake of the protest movement highlight this new dynamic. First is the three-part mockumentary Россия полное затмение, Russia Totally Eclipse, which, though broadcast from NTV, looked exactly like a typical muckraking NTV documentary. Here the director gives a seamless facade of utter seriousness as he takes the familiar tropes of the last few decades of conspiracy theory and claims to expose their actual truth. One part tells us about the secret cabal of homosexuals who control the media, another exposes the genetic basis of fascism, and all of them repeatedly invoke the Dulles Plan as established fact. This deliberate confusion of fact and fancy is itself a perfect commentary on today's media environment, in which truth claims can so easily be faked that fiction may as well be fact, and fact fiction. Most notorious, and I promise my last example from this period, is of course Anatomia Protesta, the Anatomy of Protest, the document displayed on Arkady Mamontov's talk show not long after the protest movement and Pussy Riot. Here we discover that every move made by the protest movement has been funded by the US State Department and Georgian plutocrats, while every instance of police brutality is simply a provocation. That word provocation is used as often as English uses a definite article. It's simply a provocation designed to produce the appearance of police brutality as a weapon against the regime. Even the footage of ballot stuffing turns out to be footage of a pre-election ballot casting exercise, reconfigured by the treacherous protesters as evidence of vote tampering. This is all very reminiscent of a lot of the propaganda going on during the wars of the break of Yugoslavia, when people in Sarajevo were being accused of basically shooting themselves to make it look like the Bosnian Serbs did it. At this point, conspiracy reaches total semiotic overdrive, as well as becoming the perfect state of total simulation. Everything becomes conspiracy, including the attempt to expose conspiracy. I'm not going to go into the whole MH17 airline disaster, both for lack of time and out of respect for my colleague presenting on it later. But it is a clear example of what happens when conspiracy moves from the margins to the center, to be embraced by the state and the media. The large-scale conspiracy theories can be evoked or alluded to, but their main purpose is to serve as an available backdrop or heuristic device when constantly accusing one's opponents of being the tools of evil Western governments hell-bent on Russia's destruction. The mindset of conspiracy becomes reflexive, a continuous loop based on and reinforcing a sense of anti-Russian hostility. Are there plots against Russia? Absolutely. But they should be a source of Russian pride rather than anger, since they are such a reliable and useful domestic product. In 1979, before the advent of cell phones, there was an American horror movie about a babysitter being threatened on the telephone, only to be told by the police over the phone that the calls are not coming from far away. The killer is right there because, to quote the movie's famous line, the calls are coming from inside the house. So it is with anti-Russian conspiracies. The plots against Russia are being hatched within Russia itself. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eliot, for this very rich overview and this analysis of ecosystems of conspiracy theory in Russia. We have time for discussion, so who would like to ask the first question?
Thank you so much, Eliot, for your lecture. And I surely agree about that history of international ecosystems and the socialism, but at the same time, it seems to me that there is something more global in the 1970s which brought conspiratorial thinking, which introduced conspiratorial thinking for sort of general public. So like, you know that the text of the Dulles Plan was written first half of the 1970s, and at the same time in the mid-70s, the beast computer Brussels conspiracy theories started in America. So what do you think about the 70s as, well, the sort of ground for writing contemporary conspiratorial thinking?
Oh, I completely agree. The 1970s were globally a great moment for conspiracy theory. In America, we had one exposed. And then we had no more corruption ever again. So that was good. And popular culture got interested in conspiracy in a way that it didn't, again, until the 1990s. But I would see if you compare the rise of conspiracy theory in, say, the Soviet Union and the West, they're happening at roughly the same time, and there are a lot of parallels, but I would see the development in parallels within the same framework that, of what I think of as the most compelling argument about the development of Russian postmodernism, right? Because if you take the Jameson Marxist argument about postmodernism, there should not have been postmodernism in the Soviet Union because you did not have capitalism, you did not have the media, you did not have you don't have the competing the collapse of meta-narratives and the competing truths that you have in the West. But actually, the argument that I believe is made by Lipovetsky and Epstein and others is that the official monoculture, by lumping everything that is not approved into the category of anti-Soviet, had the same sort of relativizing effect as capitalist late media culture in the West. And so basically what I'm saying is it is a global phenomenon. There is a lot of back and forth movement, much more after the 70s than in the 70s, but that I think it's worth thinking about how the local processes in the Soviet Union, even if they produced a similar result, were coming from a slightly different place.
Thanks very much. More questions? If you permit,
I would like to ask how widespread is this Dallas theory? Is it something everybody knows, or is it something that's, well, if you say to a conspiracy theorist that Dallas theory, everybody knows it.
I think it's the most famous name of the ones I've mentioned, certainly. I don't know how much everybody knows, but I know it comes up in unlikely. Nikita Mikhalkov refers to it quite frequently, for instance, and he has his blog and television show and books based on it as a way to refer to it. So I can't gauge how well known it is, except that it does appear quite frequently. I would think that if there is any of these conspiracy theories someone knows or has heard of, it would be the Dulles plan.
Yeah, Eliot, brilliant talk as always. I totally agree with your final statement that the plots against Russia come from within Russia, within the Russian house. But I'm wondering about the role of allies abroad. Obviously, the enemy is abroad. This is not to be discussed. But why would you commission diagnosis about Russophobia and conspiracies against Russia to people from Western Europe, like Juliette Chiesa or Guy Metton? Why would you try to get support by right-wing parties in Western Europe for such theories? What is the role of the allies abroad, the commissioned allies abroad?
Well, I don't think they're all commissioned. I mean, I think some of them are commissioned, but I'm very hesitant, in the absence of specific evidence that might be out there that I do not have because it's not something I'm looking for, I'm very hesitant to engage in what is ultimately, I think, a kind of paranoid conspiratorial reflex to say that anyone who is saying something that is similar to what the state media says in Russia is bought and sold. That is the same thing you hear in Russia. So when I read Guy Metton, for instance, which I have, I try to take at face value his assertions for why he believes this, and I could see, why he might. I think, and you're going to talk about Russophobia later, of course. I think one of the things that makes the Russophobic discourse and the accusations of Russophobia so compelling is that, on the one hand, my problem with the discourse of Russophobia, just as my problem with a certain discourse of anti-Americanism, is that any criticism of Russia becomes an example of Russophobia. The fact remains that there is criticism of Russia. It's not always based on anything rational. And so while I still believe that Russophobia is a very valuable tool in the conspiratorial arsenal in Russian discourse, I have a harder time completely dismissing it right now during the whole Russiagate stuff in America, which once again is based on something that I think is real to an extent, but has taken off into something that is somewhat insane. So I think there are lots of reasons then for a critic to be suspicious, say, of a reflexive criticism of Russia and Putin, and then perhaps to try to align themselves with a different position. There's a whole other process going on, of course, as we all know, in terms of the Russian government's cultivation of relationships with the right wing throughout Europe and the United States. That has been going very well for those who are on that side. And it's something that I think is particularly characteristic of Putin phase 2, now that he's back. And that has, I think, less to do with conspiracy per se than with the development of a network of a kind of global soft power on one of the few bases that is available to the Russian Federation to develop global soft power, which is the common cause that can be found with these right-wing elements. Even as they're misinterpreting so much of Russia